The record should reflect that the jury has joined us again. Welcome back, folks. I hope you had a good lunch. Great. At the end of the morning session, the prosecution was still direct examining Dr. Metzner. Doctor, I remind you that you're still under oath, and I want to remind the jury that the court has admitted Dr. Metzner's testimony only for a limited purpose. You may consider this testimony only as to the issues raised by the defendant's plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. You shall not consider this evidence for any other purpose. Mr. Brockler, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, finishing up from where we were this morning, I want to ask you if you could tell us which factors you considered from all the discovery and your examination that go to the capacity to form the intent to murder after deliberation and to act knowingly as regards July 19th and 20th, 2012.
Well, the most obvious ones are the information in the notebook. There's a number of pages where he describes his plan for the movie theater and plans other options other than going to the movie theater. And then as I mentioned before, I questioned him line by line about that. So it was very clear that he had thought about this for some time. And then the knowingly part, the plans from the perspective of carrying out the shooting were realistic, meaning he didn't go out and buy water pistols. He bought an AR-15 and a Glock and a Remington. So that goes to the knowing part. And they're the major obvious factors.
You know, speaking of the 19th and 20th of July, we have heard Dr. Reed use the phrase acutely psychotic. Is there a synonym that you would use to describe if someone was, that they were not acutely psychotic?
Well, I heard the testimony by Dr. Reed with that particular use of acutely psychotic. And the word acute has changed between DSM-4 and DSM-5, but my understanding, I think, of what Dr. Reed was talking about is if you look at...
Judge, I'm going to object as to his understanding of what Dr. Reed was talking about. That calls for speculation.
The objection as to speculation is sustained under Rule 602.
Doctor, let me ask you a different question. Did you find that the defendant was floridly psychotic on the 19th and 20th of July 2012?
Objection, relevance.
Overruled?
Go ahead, sir.
I found that he was psychotic, not that he was floridly psychotic. The distinction that I would make between psychotic and floridly psychotic or acutely psychotic is if you look at his presentation around November 11, 12, 13, when he went to Denver Health Medical Center, he was floridly psychotic. And what I mean by floridly psychotic, again, if you were in the room, you didn't have to be a psychiatrist to say that something was wrong with Mr. Holmes. It would be obvious to a layperson. On July 20th, I think that Mr. Holmes was psychotic because he was delusional. But unless you talk to him, that wouldn't be apparent to you that he was psychotic. Being psychotic or floridly psychotic, they both are very significant impairments and reflection of significant mental illness.
The fact, though, that it's the delusion that we're talking about for the psychosis on the 19th and 20th, that's the one we're talking about increasing its value?
That's correct.
And despite the determination that he had that delusion on the 19th and 20th, you still adhere to your opinions that you gave us right before lunch?
Yes, and that's in part, when you're psychotic, that doesn't mean that you lose all reasoning ability. And in fact, he was acting on an irrational psychotic notion, but he was very organized in acting on that.
Thank you. I want to ask you about some specific things from the discovery that may touch upon these capacity issues. One is, did the Do you recall what the defendant told Dr. Fenton Feinstein was his rationale for not studying for the prelims?
I'm not sure that I recall what he told them. I know what he told me, and I know what he told them, what he was doing instead of studying, but I'm not sure I recall what he told them about why he wasn't studying.
Do you recall from the reports and stuff that were generated that he told them he was prepared enough, he studied this way often, I know what I'm doing, this is no big deal, I've done it before?
That refreshes my memory, yes.
Is that what he told you?
No.
What did he tell you?
What he told me is that most of his life he was trying to please people. And one of the ways he would try to please people and please himself is by doing well in school. And one of the ways he did well in school is he studied a lot for exams because he was fearful of not doing well. And by the time prelims came up, he decided he was going to be his natural self and not study because of what other people expected of him or his fears of what would happen, but to just be himself and take the test without studying.
Did he tell you in terms of his planning how he was able to case out and draw out each of the theaters that we've seen in his notebook?
Yes.
How did he do that?
Well, he told me, I think it was between June and July, I believe he went to the Century 16 Theater 9 or 10 times and going into different theaters and figuring out which would work best. And he eventually picked Theater 9 and 10 because of the layout. And he eventually picked Theater 9 because Theater 10 was being used as overflow for people who couldn't get into Theater 9. And the Theater 10 movie, I think, was beginning at 12:15, at least the previews. And the Theater 9 movie was starting at 12, and that's why he chose Theater 9.
In terms of the planning also, you spoke with him about how he decided to make purchases online versus at stores. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Tell us what he told you.
Well, the purchases at stores was based on convenience, meaning what was close to him. The purchases online were based on price.
Forgive me for not remembering this, I didn't put a check mark right here. Did I ask you already about his use of an incorrect birth date on adultfriendfinder.com?
You have not.
Let me do that. Did you talk to him about the birth date he chose to put in when he was signing up for adultfriendfinder.com?
Yes.
And what was it?
He used the incorrect birth date because he really didn't, he wanted to be able to not be identifiable through that. And giving a wrong birthday is just one identifier that may make it hard to identify. And I think that was more related to the dating perspective than related to what he was planning to do July 20th.
Did he tell you why he chose to commit this mass murder at a movie theater?
He did, and again, it was in part related to some leading questions from me, which was based on reading his notebook, which clearly said why he chose that. And let me refresh my memory, and I'll give you the page number in a minute. This is pages 4 and 5 of my report. The theaters were chosen as primary targets related to the limited number of exits, and then the following is in quotes. Excellent spatial approach. Most moviegoers take right path in medium size, end quote. So that's was in his notebook.
Did he ever tell you that he chose the movie theater, quote, because he liked movies?
No.
Did he ever tell you that he was seeing shadows in graduate school?
No.
Did he ever tell you that he was experiencing audio hallucinations? Specifically, he'd hear music when he put his head on the pillow?
No.
Did he tell you in relation to an incident we've heard described a couple times now when he was 10, when he used cardboard to make a mark on his wrist? Did you talk with him about that?
I did.
Did he tell you that that was because he was told not to talk by his family and that was his response to that?
I don't think so.
Did he ever tell you that in part he did this because he thought the world was coming to an end?
No.
Did he tell you that he believed that shooting others can rid them of their problems and put them out of their misery?
No.
What's your understanding of why he stopped shooting in the theater in the early morning hours of July 20th, 2012?
My understanding was that the AR-15 became jammed, and he tried to fix it. He wasn't able to fix it, and he left.
Did he ever tell you that he just, independent of the AR-15 jamming, he just decided he'd shot enough people?
No.
Did you discuss with him the reasons that he purchased the weapons that he did and the timing that he did?
I don't think that I discussed with him why he purchased those specific weapons. I discussed with him the timing in the context that I think it was in May of 2012 that he decided that he was going to carry this out.
Did he tell you that he bought any of the weapons related to Hillary's screen at her apartment being slashed?
No.
Did he tell you that he believed that taking action will lead others to do the same?
No.
Did he tell you that those he murdered would be grateful to him for helping them die before the inevitable catastrophe?
No.
Can I have a moment, Your Honor?
You may.
Doctor, a final question for you. Did he ever tell you anything about, quote, a master power?
No.
I don't have any further questions, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. King, cross-examination? Yes. Take your time.
Afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
Doctor, I want to talk with you first about some of your experience, and then I'd like to talk with you about your preparations and some of the work you did for your examination in this case, and finally about some of your conclusions and the things that you learned from your interaction with Mr. Holmes, if that's okay with you.
Yes.
Now, you said, sir, that following your graduation from medical school, at the University of Maryland, and what year was that?
1975.
That you then came to Colorado, and that's when you began your residency, is that right?
Correct.
And what did that residency involve?
I graduated medical school early, and so I graduated in January of 75 rather than June of 75. So I did a 6-month medical internship. At that time, medical internships weren't required to do psychiatric residencies, but I wanted to do a medical internship. And then, beginning in July of 1975, I started my psychiatric residency. And you're asking, what does the residency involve?
Yes, sir.
So back then, the residency involved, for the first year of your psychiatric residency, you do predominantly outpatient mental health treatment, which involves both psychotherapy and providing medications when clinically indicated. You also cover, on a rotating basis, there was 15 other residents in my class at that time. You cover the psychiatric emergency room during evening hours. And so that's your first year, and you get lots of supervision from faculty about doing therapy and learning diagnoses. The second year is all inpatient, and I did 6 months of inpatient psychiatric work at what used to be called Denver General Hospital, which is now Denver Medical Health Center. And then I did another 6 months of inpatient psychiatric work at the VA hospital. And during that year, you also continue to do some outpatient therapy, but much less since you're on the wards for the whole time. After my second year, I talked to you before that I did an optional year at the state hospital. I left the residency for a year and went to the state hospital, and I was on the forensic division. And that's when I've already described providing treatment and evaluations. And for part of that year, I was the chief of psychiatry for the forensic division.
And that was in 1978?
It would have ended in June of 78. And then I came back to finish my last year of residency at the university. I was one of the chief residents in psychiatry at that time. And during that year, I was, as a chief resident, I was responsible for providing, and there were a lot of other people doing what I'm talking about. I wasn't the only one, but I was responsible for teaching medical students through their psychiatric rotation in medical school. I did all the psychiatric consults for liver transplants and kidney transplants that year. And at that time, Colorado was the only place in the country that was doing liver transplants. And I also, as other senior residents would do, I had an emergency room rotation, but rather than being the person who evaluated the people, I would supervise the first year residents who were doing the psychiatric emergency room rotation. And then I continued doing outpatient therapy. And to the extent that I had patients in outpatient therapy who needed to be hospitalized, I would be responsible. I would hospitalize them and be responsible for their care while they were hospitalized.
So suffice it to say, during the period of time of your residency and especially that year off when you were at the state hospital in Pueblo, you received a good deal of clinical experience dealing with all kinds of different mental illness, fair to say?
Yes.
And you talked specifically about your stay at the forensic unit at the Colorado State Hospital. And it sounds like to me that was particularly instructive in you in terms of your experience in having contact with psychotic individuals, individuals with serious mental illness. Is that fair to say?
Yes, and I also failed to mention that during your residency, back then, the head of forensic psychiatry at the university was Dr. John McDonald, who was a very well-known forensic psychiatrist. And I received some training that was one of my first introductions to forensic psychiatry was through Dr. McDonald.
And following that, your residency, did you work as a staff psychiatrist at Denver General Hospital, or was that the second part of your residency that you just described?
No. Once I got out of residency, my first year, ever since I've been out of residency, I've been in the private practice of psychiatry. But in addition to the private practice of psychiatry, I've done a number of things. So, for example, my first year out of residency, I took a part-time job as a staff psychiatrist at what was called West Side Mental Health Center. And that was a community mental health center in the west part of Denver that was part of what used to be the Denver General Hospital System, which is now the Denver Medical Health Center. So that was a job that I did for a year.
And following, like you said, following your residency, you've been in private practice, other than these side vocations, if you will, continuously since that point. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that the nature of your practice has changed somewhat over the years.
It's changed a lot over the years.
I think you said in the 1980s you preliminarily had an inpatient practice with a small outpatient practice as well. Is that right?
Not exactly. Rather than preliminary, you might have meant predominantly. During the 1980s, I had a significant inpatient practice, but I also had an outpatient practice. But when you're starting out in practice, you don't have a lot of patients come to you because they don't know you and you haven't started anything. So most people started out in inpatient psychiatry because the hospitals were always looking for a doctor who did inpatient psychiatry. So they would get people referred who didn't have a doctor, and they went down a list, and if you wanted referrals, they would send you referrals. And that was a way of building up your referral base.
Suffice to say, folks that are inpatient could very often be more seriously ill than the folks you might see just coming in off the street on an outpatient basis.
Not only could be, to be hospitalized psychiatrically, almost by definition, you're sicker, more symptomatic than if you could be treated on an outpatient basis.
Now you talked about the differences between conducting a clinical examination and a forensic examination, correct?
Yes.
And the different approaches that you take and the different considerations that you have to make. Is that right?
Yes.
And you're specifically trained as your area of specialty is forensic psychiatry, right?
Yes.
Nevertheless, the fact that you specialize in forensic psychiatry doesn't prevent you from having a clinical practice, does it?
Well, in fact, no, it doesn't. And in fact, if you want, in my opinion, to be a good forensic psychiatrist, it has to be built on, you got to have the clinical background to begin with.
So there's nothing about being a forensic, having a specialty that then precludes you from doing the clinical work or other work as you see fit. You've moved into corrections, for example. Fair to say?
Fair to say.
And in the context of your private practice, it sounds like you have gradually moved away from a more towards a more corrections-oriented practice over time. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
And so now at this point, you said that you have a few patients that you continue to see on an outpatient basis, but the bulk of your work for some time now has been working in a corrections environment. In other words, evaluating prisons and jails, as you said, which might be under court order for proper treatment or of mentally ill individuals.
That's correct.
You are not now, nor have you ever been, a research scientist in the area of psychiatry, have you?
Well, I've done research in the area of psychiatry. I would not, and the research I've done is predominantly clinical research. I'm certainly not a basic scientist, and although I've done research stuff, no, I don't consider myself to be a researcher.
Now, you talked about first, you don't have extensive experience with the mass murder cases, do you?
I do not have extensive experience doing a sanity evaluation with people who've done mass murder. I certainly have a lot of experience having talked with people who've done mass murders, but that's, it's a lot different doing this kind of evaluation of 125 hours and talking with someone who's in prison who did mass murder and talking with them for an hour.
Understood. And suffice it to say, mass murder is a rare event as murders go. Fair to say?
That is very fair to say.
And especially when you're talking about events such as this one, where there are a large number of victims who are deceased, that is exceptionally rare, is it not?
Yes.
Almost so rare that there's really very little to compare it to in terms of other cases. Fair to say?
I think it's fair to say that from a scientific basis, comparisons you make are not scientific. They're anecdotal.
Now, in terms of your preparation for this examination, you indicated you received quite a volume of materials, and I think you've outlined those pretty clearly. In addition to the discovery or police reports that you received and the interviews of witnesses and the victims' medical reports, you also received information that related to what I'll call the history of Mr. Holmes. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
You received medical records and psychiatric records, particularly that pertain to members of Mr. Holmes' family.
I did.
You received a social history of Mr. Holmes' family that was created by my office, correct?
Yes.
You received videotape recordings of Mr. Holmes when he was hospitalized, at least one, when he was hospitalized at Denver Health Medical Center in November of 2012.
Yes.
You received interviews, numerous interview reports, in addition to the social history, which contained interview reports. You received interviews of family members, yes?
Yes.
Friends, teachers.
Correct.
Both in elementary school, high school, undergraduate school, and graduate school, correct?
Yes.
Co-workers.
Yes.
A tremendous amount of information leading back in time.
That is accurate.
You also received the treatment records of Mr. Holmes' psychiatric history, being the treatment he received from Drs. Fenton and Feinstein, as well as the treatment records of Mel Lipsey, a social worker that saw Mr. Holmes when he was a child.
Yes.
All of these things are things that you took into consideration, along with the police reports and other discovery that you were presented in forming the bases for your opinions. Is that correct, sir?
Yes.
Now, you saw Mr. Holmes on 4 different occasions for a total of 25 and a half hours, right?
Yes.
And also, he was observed by the hospital staff down at CMHIP and Dr. Pounds, and you're familiar with these folks, are you not?
Yes.
Throughout your private practice, you said that you've maintained a consulting relationship with the state hospital in Pueblo, is that right?
Yes.
And as part of that, you have done other sanity and competency evaluations on different individuals down there, is that right?
Yes.
And you consult with them, is that right?
Correct.
And really the folks that were assigned to this case were really top-notch people, fair to say?
Yes.
Now, in addition to your review of all the materials and your clinical interviews with Mr. Holmes, well, let me ask you first, before we move on from the clinical interview aspect. I think you've indicated why it was important to you to get all of the history and the materials that you could before seeing Mr. Holmes. And that was to be prepared to evaluate the statements that he made and to corroborate those statements. Fair to say?
In part, yes.
And in part to give you direction on what might be areas that you should pursue?
Yes, I did not want to do my evaluation and then review the records and find something that could have been important, and I don't have the opportunity to ask him about it.
And you saw Mr. Holmes in 2013, is that right?
In August of 2013.
So a little bit more than a year after the date of the offense of July 2012.
Correct.
At that point in time, Mr. Holmes was medicated, was he not?
Yes.
With the antipsychotic medication that he's currently on.
With an antipsychotic and with an antidepressant medication, and yes.
And you have no doubt, do you, sir, that that medication affected the way he presented and affected his responses to your questioning?
I think that medication resulted in him being more organized in responses.
And certainly, it's your testimony that during the offense, and we'll talk a little bit more about the florid or acute psychosis later, but during the period of time preceding and during the shooting in 2012, it's your opinion that Mr. Holmes was psychotic at that point in time.
That is correct.
That his thinking was disorganized, correct?
His thinking was disorganized in the context of delusional thinking. He had other very organized thinking, but
Sure.
Believing the delusion, and in that aspect it was disorganized.
And I think you explained that distinction for us pretty clearly, and that is, if you're trying to accomplish a shooting, buying a firearm is a logical, goal-oriented move to make, right?
Correct.
But what you're saying is Mr. Holmes engaged in these logical, goal-oriented moves in order to accomplish a larger purpose, which was, in fact, delusional and illogical, correct?
Correct.
Why is it important to conduct a clinical interview of Mr. Holmes or of anyone that you're doing a sanity evaluation of? Why can't you just read the data and render your opinion based upon what you perceive was going on during the time of the offense?
Well, again, my understanding is the question of the capacities that we've talked about is at the time of the commission of the alleged acts. And so the primary source of finding out, at least beginning to find out, what his state of mind was at the time of the alleged acts is to talk with him. And I also mentioned to you that in the large amount of discovery, there's also things in there that's inaccurate. So if you base things on discovery that may not be accurate, you may not come up with an accurate assessment. And plus the fact, even if all the discovery was accurate, that the kinds of information that you need to do this kind of assessment usually isn't directly in that discovery. There's certain things that you can infer from the discovery, and there's certain things from the discovery that tell you, I ought to ask about this. But so that's the reasons.
Would you have rendered an opinion on sanity or diagnosis if you had not had the opportunity to personally meet and interview Mr. Holmes?
Well, and it depends. And the reason I say it depends, if I had access, for example, to Dr. Reed's videotape evaluation, you can render from an ethical perspective, and this comes back to my discussion about the American Academy of Psychiatry and Law. There's certain ethics that are promulgated by that organization. It is ethical to render an opinion.
And just so I'm clear, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but my question was not is it ethical to do it, but in this case, would you have done that without seeing Mr. Holmes?
And my answer to you is depends on the circumstances. So, for example, if I had access to the discovery, which includes Dr. Reed's video, and I was asked to render an opinion, I would probably have rendered an opinion, but I would have given a disclaimer that it's limited because I didn't personally evaluate Mr. Holmes, and that's a limitation on my opinion, because it's a big difference, even when you have a videotape. It's a big difference of being in the room and interacting with someone than seeing it on videotape.
And it's a big difference being able to ask the questions you want to ask to clarify the issues you want to clarify as opposed to relying on the questions asked by somebody else. Fair to say?
Correct.
You talked about the different methodologies that can be employed, and you don't normally videotape, and you gave some reasons why you don't do that. Is that right?
Correct.
And you have found in your practice that the methods that you use are accurate and are effective, and that's why you use the methods that you do, correct?
Yes.
And that's why you continue to use them in this case, because they've worked for you in the past over time.
Correct.
So, while Dr. Reed may choose to videotape his examination, that doesn't necessarily mean that that is the only valid way to conduct an examination. As we said, different psychiatrists have different practices.
Not only does that mean that, it is the standard of care for forensic psychiatric evaluations does not require videotape examination. Now, if you videotape it, it's certainly within the standard of care, but not videotaping it in no means that it's not within the standard of care.
In addition to the interviews that you did and the materials that you reviewed, you asked Drs. Gray and Mancuso to do some psychological and neuropsychological testing. Is that right?
Yes.
And you wanted to make sure that your clinical opinions that you were forming based upon your review of the materials and based upon your contact with Mr. Holmes were consistent with what the psychological testing revealed. Is that right?
Correct.
You also wanted to see if there was any evidence of malingering that would show up in this subjective testing.
Correct.
And in your experience, the MMPI, for example, which is a psychological test, is that right?
Correct.
Is helpful, can be very helpful in doing that.
Yes.
The questions that you presented to Drs. Gray and Mancuso were, are there any neuropsychological deficits, number one? Is there evidence of serious mental illness, psychosis? Is there evidence of a personality disorder, and is there evidence of malingering? Is that right?
Correct.
Now, to be clear, and I think you said this pretty clearly, but I just want to repeat it because I think it bears repeating. Based upon your analysis of this entire case, your contact with Mr. Holmes, your comparison of Mr. Holmes' statements to the statements to the other doctors, to the evidence that's contained in the record, you are convinced, you have ruled out as part of your diagnosis that Mr. Holmes malingering as an issue, essentially.
That is accurate.
You are confident that Mr. Holmes is not faking a mental illness, correct?
I am.
How confident are you in that opinion?
You're never 100%, but as confident as I can be.
And you're never 100% about any of your conclusions, are you?
That's correct.
Now that conclusion that you made is supported by the psychological and neuropsychological testing that's been done, correct?
Correct.
There's no indication in that testing, either the testing done by the defense or by Drs. Gray and Manguso, that Mr. Holmes is feigning symptoms, correct?
That's correct.
There's no indication that during the course of that testing that he was not putting forth a valid effort in that testing, correct?
Correct.
Now, you talked about the standard with regard to sanity in the state of Colorado, and you talked first about the need to establish the existence of a mental disease or defect, or not, right?
Yes.
After reviewing all of the material and speaking to Mr. Holmes, you've reached a conclusion that Mr. Holmes suffers from a serious psychotic mental illness. Is that right?
A serious mental illness associated with psychotic features, correct.
And to be clear, that he was psychotic, in fact, due to this illness on the date of offense, July 20, 2012.
Correct.
You said the most likely diagnosis is schizoaffective disorder, along with trichotillomania and an anxiety disorder. Is that correct?
Social anxiety disorder.
Now, trichotillomania, what's that?
That's hair pulling. It's a form of an obsessive compulsive disorder, something that he's had for some time. In many ways, it's unrelated to his actions on July 20th, but that's what it is.
And he's, in fact, had this hair pulling disorder as far back as middle school and high school. Is that right?
Correct.
There's some indication in the notebook of him pulling out enough hair that he would cause bald spots in high school. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, just so that we're clear, I want to talk a little bit about the criteria for schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder. But it sounds to me like, in terms of the seriousness of the disorder, that schizoaffective disorder is as serious a mental illness as schizophrenia is.
That's correct. It's a little less common than schizophrenia, which is not common to begin with. But yes, and I don't think you can say either one is more serious than the other. They're both serious disorders.
And essentially, and we'll look at the criteria again, but essentially what schizoaffective disorder is schizophrenia plus a mood disorder.
Correct.
And a mood disorder doesn't mean you're in a bad mood. Well, it does, but a really bad mood, fair to say.
Well, a mood disorder, you could either have significant depression, or you could have what's called mania, which is just the opposite of depression, or you could have a mixed state, sometimes mania, sometimes depression.
And what's bipolar depression?
Well, bipolar disorder is a mood disorder in which you have at least one episode of mania. And what I mean by mania is when symptoms of mania include the following: a prolonged euphoric mood, grandiose ideas, meaning you get an idea that you think really makes a lot of sense and turns out to make no sense at all. And so people, for example, will go on spending sprees and can spend thousands of dollars because they had this great idea that if they did this, things would work out, and they ruin themselves financially in a manic state. You can get what's called flight of ideas, in which you get rapid ideas come into your mind so much that it's hard to concentrate. You can get decreased need for sleep. People in a manic mood can be very productive because they're very hyperactive, thinking fast, and really don't need sleep. And so they're the essential features of mania. Depression is feelings of helplessness, worthlessness, hopelessness, feeling very down in the dumps, depressed, having thoughts of wanting to hurt or kill yourself, having a sleep disturbance, trouble going to sleep or staying asleep, losing weight, having no appetite. So if you have a bipolar disorder, you've had to have at least one manic episode. And the reason they call it bipolar, it's not uncommon to have not only manic episodes, but also depressive episodes. And sometimes they can rapidly cycle from a manic episode to a depressive episode, and sometimes you have a manic episode, it goes away, you're doing well for a while, and then you get a depressive episode.
And so someone with that type of understanding that everyone is different and every disease is different, but someone with that type of disorder may commonly be very depressed for a period of time, where they experience those symptoms, a loss of sleep, inability to sleep, appetite, can't move, get out of bed, those kind of things, and then may cycle into a manic phase where it's almost the opposite, where they can't sleep. They experience time moving quickly sometimes. They may feel invincible in a lot of ways. Fair to say?
Fair to say, and let me tell you what I'm not talking about. All of us get depressed, and all of us at times feel very good. So short periods of depression is not a major depressive disorder. And, you know, your team wins a game and you feel great for a day or two. That's not a manic episode. When I talk about a manic episode or a depressive episode, it's also associated with significant functional impairments. And those functional impairments can be at work, at school, or in your relationships, and they're significant.
You saw evidence, talking to Mr. Holmes, of the existence of a major depressive disorder of some kind, correct?
Correct.
He reported in the notebook that he had very little energy at times during the spring of 2012, correct?
Yes.
He reported in the notebook that he couldn't get out of bed for extended period of times, correct?
Correct.
And I think I remember him having to tell himself, "Get up, Bambi, get up," in order to make himself get out of bed to go to class.
Correct.
Mr. King, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We need to take a break for one of the jurors, so let's go ahead and take 20 minutes, folks. Please remember my admonitions during the break. Thank you. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury has exited the courtroom. This is the same juror who was having some issues. I think it was a week ago Friday, and she's indicating in one note, which I'll mark as number 171, juror question number 171, it's a little hot in here. Can we cool it down, please? Thank you. And then in the other note, which I will mark as juror question form number 172, she writes, "I'm going to be sick." And in both, she wrote down her number. So that's why I interrupted you, Mr. King. We'll wait and see when she feels better. I'll keep you updated as much as I can. So we'll take a recess, and then I'll come back out when she's ready to go.
Judge, before
Yes.
you leave, can I approach the bench with counsel? It doesn't have to be on the record.
Oh, okay, yes. All right, is there anything else anybody wants to bring up at this time? No? Okay, well, Ms. Tish McGuire. Okay, all right, we'll be on break then. Doctor, you can be on break as well. Okay, thank you. The court will be in recess. Thank you.